It was a regular weekend just like any other back in October 1994, and this old gamer felt like taking a break from gaming for a change. So I thought, maybe I should catch a movie with some friends. So I grabbed the newspaper like we used to do back in the day and browsed the movie listings. And I shit you not, this is what it looked like. Pulp Fiction, The Shawshank Redemption, Forrest Gump, and the first Jurassic Park were playing. 2 of my top 10 films of all time, and another timeless classic were sharing that tiny black and white square we used to call the movie section. That particular weekend was a 1 in a million moment in the history of cinema, and I think its video game equivalent was the year 2000. Baldur's Gate 2 and Diablo 2 were released that year, and many consider the former to be the best CRPG of all time, and the latter to be the best ARPG of all time. And I think the endless number of Baldur's Gate 2 and Diablo 2 ripoff inspired games that we have had in the last 22 years are proof enough of just how influential these 2 titles have been. And while many of these Baldur's Gate 2 and Diablo 2 rip-off inspired games are just plain bad, some of them are actually pretty good. Some of them have even been labeled spiritual successors to these timeless classics. And of course, there's always people who are not in agreement when this label is stamped upon a certain Diablo 2 or Baldur's Gate 2 clone, and some others who laugh cynically when it happens. And no, this agreement or disagreement does not happen because you have a superior understanding of what the game is about, and yes, that includes your superior understanding of the set of rules that's used in the game. These agreements or disagreements depend on how much you value each of the game's many aspects and how well the ripoff in question was able to replicate them. Now let's talk briefly about Titan Quest. This is one of my favorite Diablo 2 clones. The skill system, the loot, the randomization of enemy talents, the item enhancement possibilities, these are all things Titan Quest got very right. But then there's people like this guy, the lead designer for Path of Exile as I understand it, one of the most prominent modern-day Diablo 2 clones out there.
There were games like Titan Quest that came out where I played through it and said, this is amazing, this is the new game I'm going to play. Then I started my second playthrough and didn't get a quarter of the way through it because I played it before as far as I was concerned. And so random levels dramatically help people replay the game.
You know, that's just like, your opinion, man.
Yeah, well, I don't give a shit about procedurally generated levels. This has next to no importance to me. I also don't care about rifts, seasons, multiplayer, or any other form of online competitive features. Grim Dawn, for example, has none of that shit. Its endgame comes in the form of really long story-driven questlines that grant you access to dungeons that are very extremely difficult, that you can't portal in and out of, and that will be closed forever once you are done with them or if you die. Grim Dawn doesn't have procedurally generated levels or even acts. It's just one big map that you clear as you progress through the game. And while it does rip off Diablo 2 shamelessly, it also brings to the table quite a few things Diablo 2 didn't have. There's multiclassing, for example, and I think they nailed it. It has a constellation perk system that allows you to further customize your character. There are huge hidden areas for you to discover, bounties, and there are even a few quests with multiple outcomes. So basically, Grim Dawn is an RPG that rips off Diablo 2, but it presses all the right keys for me. It doesn't replicate everything Diablo 2 did, but the things it doesn't replicate are not all that important to me. And the new things that it brought to the table are things that contribute to the experience that I expect to have when playing these games. If you don't care about quests, if you don't care about multi-classing in ARPGs, if you are a hardcore online competitive dude and seasons and rifts are your thing, if you're big on procedurally generated levels, then chances are Grim Dawn will not press the right keys for you. And that takes us neatly along to today's subject matter, Pillars of Eternity. Now, many of you consider Baldur's Gate 2 to be the best CRPG ever made. Some even say it's without question the best game ever made. And whether or not you agree with this assessment, there's more than enough Baldur's Gate 2 clones out there to prove that this game was the before and after of the genre, to the point that it seems like the highest praise a game in the genre can get is to be labeled Baldur's Gate 2's spiritual successor. For many, that game is Pillars of Eternity. And I happen to be one of those many. But because we all have different buttons that need to be pressed before we are ready to label this game as that other game's spiritual successor, I was curious about what you guys had to say about Pillars, so I reclined in my chair, opened a bag of Doritos, and browsed some of your comments in the comment section of the channel. Turns out that some of you loved it, some of you weren't impressed, and some of you hated it. And while I do think the truth is somewhere in between all those arguments you guys used to destroy or to praise the first Pillars game, I am a lot closer to the camp of those who loved it, because it pressed all my right keys. Welcome to Yold Entertainment, my name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumping for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. Which you absolutely don't give a shit about, I know. Because you've all played this one, and for whatever reason, you're curious about my opinion. And that's fine, my friend, I'll drink to that. So I'll say it straight, I loved it. Make no mistake about it though, this game rips off Baldur's Gate 2, and it does so shamelessly. If I were a cynical man, I would even say they do it proudly. Oh wait, I am a cynical man. And I'll admit, it fails to replicate many of the things that turned Baldur's Gate 2 into the genre-defining game it eventually became. And some of those things are very important to me. But it also brought some stuff to the game that added to the experience I always look for in a CRPG. So join me as we revisit the game that revived the flame of the good old days. And yes, this is not going to be an objective review, and yes, expect there to be some feelings spilled all over this one, because if a group of people were passionate enough to kickstart and develop this thing into existence and rekindle the fire of adventure from the good old days, I could do no less. So let's get to it. Character creation and character progression are up first. Pillars of Eternity's character creation and progression system isn't the best there's ever been, but before you even get to the character creation screen, the game throws this little intro at you.
5 wagons grope blindly for the path on a starless night, their master glancing ever upward to the skies for assurance that he is on the right course. A dim lantern his only protection against the encroaching darkness. But the skies bring no comfort, shining no light, betraying no hint of what they know. The caravan carries travelers bound for the frontier hamlet of Gilded Vale, you among them, where a local lord has offered land and wealth to settlers from abroad looking for a fresh start. You have taken suddenly ill, sweating and shivering, and one of the other travelers signals for the caravan master to stop on your behalf. He pulls up just in time to avoid plowing into the trunk of a fallen tree that bars the way ahead. You will go no further tonight.
And there is something that I find endlessly enrapturing about the tone of the narration, the still picture that they show while it's playing, and the type of intimate, small predicament you'll have to deal with once you start your adventure. I think it was a nice little way to get you invested in your character and immersed in the situation. So hell yeah, let's see who that sick guy or gal in the caravan is. So you jump into Pillar's character creation screen, and right off the bat, the game lets you know that it isn't fucking around with its lore. The first thing you choose in Pillars of Eternity is your gender. In most other games, this decision is completely irrelevant, aside from its obvious cosmetic aspect and perhaps the choice of romantic interests if the game has any. But in Pillars you get a nice little description of the roles men and women play as a general rule in the various societies around the world of Eora, and there is even some hypertext for you to inquire further about these places if you want to. And the same goes for races, classes, subclasses, and backgrounds. The game is teeming with relevant and interesting lore references everywhere, and I loved it. Next stop is choosing your race. You have your classic trinity of fantasy races: humans, dwarves, elves, and 3 races that are specific to Pillars of Eternity's lore: the Orlan, the Amawa, and the Godlike. Each of these races also have sub-races of sorts, and again, I think the lore behind all the races and sub-races is superb. It made me want to jump into the game immediately. Gameplay-wise, races come with bonuses and penalties like they usually do. Dwarves have your typical might and constitution bonuses and a dexterity penalty, and the same thing applies to other races. Sub-races add additional bonuses. Dwarves, for example, can be boreal dwarves or mountain dwarves. Because boreal dwarves live in the cold steppes and make a living on hunting and fishing, they have a 15% bonus to accuracy, while mountain dwarves are resistant to poison and disease. Godlikes, for example, are creatures that have been touched by a god, and they can take 4 different forms, each with impressive unique talents, and as many body types as races that there are in the game's lore. There are 11 classes for you to choose from in Pillars of Eternity. Many of them you are surely going to be familiar with right away, like fighters, paladins, priests, rogues, monks, wizards, and druids, and some others like ciphers are a bit more lore specific. They all come with their beefy chunk of lore and their bonuses and penalties, but also with their choice of additional available skills. Or if you're a paladin, a choice of orders that you can belong to, or if you are a priest, a choice of deity. There are no archetypes per se in Pillars of Eternity, and some people may find this simplistic and disappointing. You can also choose attributes in Pillars of Eternity, and the game is pretty straightforward and informative about which attributes matter most for your class. So much so, in fact, that there's a yellow star indicating the most important attributes for your class, and a gray one which indicates which other attributes you have to pay attention to. If you have some experience with RPGs though, you probably know that some classes can fulfill more than one role competently, and that's what you're going to focus the most on when choosing which attribute to favor. And then comes your choice of culture. This one's interesting. Story-wise, some people's initial reaction to you will depend on your character's culture, and there are even dialogue choices that become available depending on where you're from. But there's also raw attribute bonuses that you get depending on your culture, so if you want to roleplay like a champ, and there is a certain part of the world that interests you, you may want to go back and change things around a little in the attribute screen to make the most out of everything. Your initial equipment also depends on your culture, so you might want to pay attention to that as well. Backgrounds add bonuses to your skills, and yes, this is a thing, even if you can't directly manipulate it on the character creation screen. But these backgrounds also add a little bit of flavor to your character, as there are some dialogue choices that depend on them. To round things up, there are some cosmetic options available, but there aren't too many, and they are nothing special. I also wasn't crazy about the portraits available, but it's easy to import your own like I did with my main and the mercenary that you can see here. Voices are decent, but they are not even in the vicinity of Storm of Zahir, for example, or the Icewind Dale series in terms of their charisma or personality. Then there is of course leveling in Pillars of Eternity, and it's interesting. Again, not incredible, but there are a few interesting things about it. There is no multi-classing per se in Pillars of Eternity, as there is in Pillars of Eternity 2, or in most other CRPGs like the Pathfinder games, or more recently, Black Geyser. But every 2 levels you may choose to acquire lesser version of skills that are not specific to your class. And I may be alone in this, but I think I prefer this to multi-classing as a concept. There are also general skills that make a huge difference if you know what you're going for, and they are categorized in offensive, defensive, and utility. You can go for the 2-weapon fighting skill for your rogue, for example, to turn it into a single target damage machine. Or you can choose some of the many defensive talents on offer instead of a class-specific skill depending on what you are aiming at. Pillars has an amazing stat panel that tells you important details about your characters, like who's taken the most damage thus far, who's done the most damage, who's scored the most crits, and so on and so forth. And this gives you a pretty good idea of how your leveling decisions are working out. Now, one thing that I always look forward to when it comes to my character's class, race, sub-race, culture, and whatnot, is for these things to have an impact beyond combat. And although belonging to this or that race or having such or such other background is not as impactful as it is, for example, in Arcanum or Dragon Age, in Pillars of Eternity there are plenty of dialogue options and things do happen at least slightly differently depending on your race, your class, and even the paladin order you belong to if you're a pala, for example. Overall, while I think it was a little bit rough around the edges, the character creation and leveling system in Pillars of Eternity was good enough for me to do things mostly my way in all departments. Gameplay. There's a lot going on in Pillars of Eternity in the gameplay department. There's combat, exploration, scripted events, stronghold management, and a few puzzles. Most of it is great fun, but the game does shoot itself in the foot with a few of its features. But like I said, for the most part it presses all the right keys for me. The initial stretch in this game is amongst my favorites of all time. Probably my second favorite ever. Since your caravan's been forced to take a break because there's a giant tree barring the way and there is no way around it, you start your adventure at an improvised camp. The caravan master explains the situation. He doesn't like the place where you've been forced to camp because local tribesmen are known to attack and kill those who enter ruins like the one that's right behind you. And this is a clever little way to introduce you to some of the most important aspects of the game's lore. The man talks about Engwithan ruins, Erglanfath natives, Beowigs, Adra, and so on and so forth. He only tells you the very basics because that's all you need to know not to get yourself into trouble that night. And after all, he's just a caravan master, not a scholar. You have taken ill, but it's nothing too serious. The caravan master explains that there are some local berries with which you can make a tea that'll get rid of your illness. So your first task is to procure said berries. And this is the perfect task for you to set out with your first companion, a woman named Kalisha. This first quest will give you the opportunity to engage in a couple of easy fights to familiarize yourself with the ins and outs of combat, and you'll also get the chance to engage Kalisha in small talk about both of your pasts and the reasons why you came to be on that caravan to Gilded Vale. And in the process, the game sneaks in a bit more of its precious, juicy lore. But just as you are about to return to camp, things go tits up in the gnarliest possible way, and you find yourself in the best situation to get an adventure rolling in an RPG. There's only one way out of this shitstorm, and it lies forward. And this initial stretch has a bit of everything. Scripted events that take place at the direst moment of the action, Combat, dramatic tension, exploration, impactful decisions, and the accidental witnessing of a game-changing event. That's how Pillars of Eternity introduces most of the aspects of its gameplay and lore, and I think it's tight. It's exciting, cohesive, there are no information dumps, and everyone's attitude and behavior seems to be in tune with what's going on. As for the people you meet during this initial stretch, you don't have the typical companion who antagonizes you because she's too cool to be in your party, or the ridiculously agreeable companion whom your other badass companion is constantly going to be having arguments with because their personalities need to conflict. They also don't sound like modern-day Zoomers who don't belong in this fantasy world, and that's what makes the first hour of the game endlessly immersive. After that first initial stretch, you find yourself in an area that is reminiscent of some of the many forest locations you have in the original Baldur's Gate. This one is there for you to stretch your solo combat legs and get a little bit of practice with some of those tactics. You know, learning the importance of having 2 sets of weapons, learning the importance of choking points, getting the timing right for those skills and spells, etc. And then you find yourself in Gilded Vale, and that's where you'll be picking up your first companions, getting your first quests, and gathering the next piece of the puzzle. Combat is probably the most important aspect of Pillars of Eternity's gameplay, and I think you can play in the standard difficulty and still find the game to be sufficiently challenging if your isometric real-time with pause skills are a little bit rusty, or if you're fairly new to the isometric CRPG subgenre. Then you have the hard difficulty, which might be the right one for you if you're a seasoned CRPG guy or gal, and the Path of the Damned difficulty for a second playthrough, or if you like a challenge right off the bat. One thing that I like about combat in Pillars of Eternity is that it's not a game of references. It's not about learning what a gazillion spells do and how they overcome this or that immunity. There are no situations that funnel you into doing the one thing that works.
But Alex, that's what makes combat good in these RPGs, because the Game Master...
You do not have a fucking Game Master in video games. As I was saying, combat in Pillars of Eternity is tactical, like truly tactical, which means that your success depends more on the decisions you make in combat and how you approach the fight than figuring out the right spell to purge that immunity. Oh, so the enemy is slow, but he hits like a fucking truck. Very well, let's kite him and then wear it down. Oh, so these guys are made of tissue paper, but they hit like a train and have damage over time and incapacitating spells, and they are located at each end of a group of tanky mobs. That looks like a problem. If we attack from the south, even if we kill one of them quickly, we won't get the chance to neutralize the other before he nails us. And it'll be the same thing if we attack from the north. I know, let's divide our party into 2 groups and take them down simultaneously. Oh look, it worked! We're vastly outnumbered for this upcoming combat encounter, but look, there is a choking point there. Ah, it's working. And look, the first guy at the choking point is a damaged sponge, but he hits like a pussy. That guy in the back cannot reach us, but if he ever does, he's going to fuck us. I know, let's take care of him first from a safe distance, while our tank trades blows with a pussy tanky mob at the choking point. There are fights like this, in which you can become paralyzed or sick, or you can get struck with a type of damage that hurts you badly. But it's not a fucking game over when it happens. It's not like you have to make your characters completely immune to paralyze or to the type of damage that's making your life miserable to even have a chance of surviving the fight. Of course, knowing the right spell for the situation makes a significant difference, but you can also think your way around combat encounters that you may not be 100% optimized for and still emerge victorious. And it still won't be an easy fight, which is good, because we do like a good challenge, just not a bullshit challenge. And there's a sweet variety of enemies. There are Shorips, which are Svarts by a different name, and Vithraks, which are Illithids by a different name, Delemgans and Puigra, Pigra, these fuckers that they could have called Dryads. And then there's Wizards, Trolls, Ogres, Drakes. Yeah, they borrowed liberally from Baldur's Gate 2. But hey, Baldur's Gate 2 wasn't even the first game where these creatures made their first appearance either, so just saying. And these enemies have a beefy and diverse array of attacks. Some hit like trucks, some can paralyze you, some are able to mind control you, some can teleport, some do lightning, frost, or fire damage, some do damage over time, some summon stuff. There are all type of baddies waiting for you in Pillars of Eternity, and they'll demand much more from you than your standard tank and spank tactic. And this makes all those primary and secondary combat mechanics matter. Your formation matters a lot in Pillars, your skills matter, your gear matters, your choice of primary and secondary weapon matters, and it matters a lot. And if you ask me, those are the signs of good combat. Be warned though, friendly AI is dogshit in this game. And when I say dogshit, I'm talking steaming pile of dog crap.
Oh, I don't care about that. I always turn the AI off in these games.
I hear you say, yeah, cool story, bro. The thing is that friendly AI is so bad here that even clicking somewhere to have a character move to that spot has a chance of not working in the intended way.
Enemies ahead. I think you should go in front. Soak the damage. Joe? What are you doing, man?
Attacking!
No, you're not. Go around me. It's a doorway, Joe.
Help! What is this sorcery?
Joe, there's plenty of room. Go around me. What is your fucking problem?
To say that I don't always agree with Joe's takes would be a monumental understatement, but I 100% agree with him on this. And while this didn't dampen my fun in any significant way, it can get annoying from time to time. I'm also happy with the arsenal of moves at your disposal and how the game handles them. Some skills, typically those which are the bread and butter of your combat tactics, get a certain amount of uses per combat, rather than per rest. Warriors have knockdown, paladins have flames of devotion, mages have arcane assault, rogues have crippling strike, and you can use them regularly in every combat encounter. But for the most powerful and or situational spells, you only get a certain amount of uses per rest, and I think this is masterfully balanced. I like that spell management, so to speak, is simple and intuitive, but robust in Pillars of Eternity. Wizards have spell books, of course, and they can add spells to their magic arsenal by learning them from scrolls or by reading them from other spell books. You can even have different spell books with different spells if you want to be that versatile as a spellcaster. But unlike D&D, your spell slots do not determine the amount of uses you have for a given spell. They determine the spells you are able to cast. The number of spells you cast depend on your level, and whether or not you choose the extra spell use skill when you level instead of learning a new spell. There's also cool druid magic that affects enemies and allies differently, various types of crowd control spells, animal companions, and skills that synergize with their talents, you name it. And it doesn't feel like there's an overlapping of effects between your skills. I think your arsenal of moves in Pillars of Eternity is broad without being overwhelming. I also like how combat, questing, and everything else, except Stronghold management, is very well balanced in this game. There's this location you arrive at, a stronghold called Cadnua. Underneath this abandoned fortress lies a 15-floor dungeon filled with combat encounters, including several boss battles, NPCs, loot, hidden rooms, etc. It feels like a tribute of sorts to the main dungeon in the Temple of Elemental Evil, or more so, the Watcher's Keep in Baldur's Gate 2, a multi-floor dungeon that you get when you install the Throne of Bhaal expansion pack. Actually, this location in Pillars of Eternity ends up being, well, the Watcher's Keep. It is a bit less challenging and interesting than the Temple of Elemental Evil or the Watcher's Keep in Baldur's Gate 2, perhaps because it is precisely a little bit too derivative of its source of inspiration. But what I like about this dungeon is that you can try and tackle the first 13 floors as a low-level character, because you like your combat challenges just like you like your Latin American films, long and difficult to figure out. Or you can do what you came to do in the first place and then leave to continue with the game's critical path, and maybe come back at a later time when you feel like you're up to the challenge. I do think that Pillars is a little bit lacking when it comes to variety of combat situations. Now, for the sake of this explanation, we are going to differentiate combat encounters from combat situations. Let's say that every fight in the game is a combat encounter, you know? Your party of adventurers against a group of baddies in a certain location. And those are great in Pillars. And let's call combat situation any situation derived from the story that results in a fight that is a bit different from your standard combat encounter. For example,
Minor spoilers coming your way.
For Expeditions Viking. In Expeditions Viking, there is this one passage in which your main character gets captured, so your other companions have to appoint a leader and come to your rescue. And there is this other situation in which you control one of your companions on a solo mission. In Wasteland 3, for example, there's a dramatic hold the line moment in which you have to defend your stronghold from an invading army. And in Dragon Age and Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, there is a moment in which the game cuts to what your B team is doing, and of course, you're in control of the B team for that situation. And there is one pretty decent defend your stronghold moment in Pillars, and it gets elevated due to the quality of the narration that precedes it. But as a combat encounter, it still feels like your standard party of 6 combat encounter with a few allies. I wish there had been solo moments, rescue missions, hold the line episodes, or let's take the battle to the bad guy passages. But this is just a nitpick. I still think combat in Pillars of Eternity is pretty dang solid. Then there is questing in Pillars of Eternity, and it worked really well for me, because everything you do in this game is deeply imbued in the game's lore, and the game's quests often have at least something to do with the situation of the world at large. Now, this is the structure of your typical fetch quest. NPC asks you to retrieve an item. You go and fetch the item, you bring it back. There are a million examples of quests that follow this structure in RPGs. In Storm of Zahir, for example, you meet an adventurer at one of the game's many taverns. During Phase 1, this guy tells you that he lost an amulet that was important to him. The reason why this amulet is important and everything else you need to know about this quest is revealed to you there and then. And these reasons have nothing to do with your main mission or the state of the world at large. He could have given you any other explanation, and it could have been any other item, and it would have been exactly the same. So in Phase 2, you fight and kill some spiders and find the amulet. Nothing further is revealed about the quest, the owner of the item, or the item. And in Phase 3, you return the amulet to the NPC. And that's it. Now let's take a look at a quest that has the same structure in Pillars of Eternity. Phase 1, you meet the NPC Alfra. You already know of Alfra's existence, because she is Kalicia's sister. And it was Kalicia who helped you find the berries to cure your illness during the game's opening act. And while you were both searching for the berries, you engaged in some small talk about several topics including family, and her sister came out in the conversation, although not by name. That is, if you talked to Kalicia about these topics. Alfra is pregnant and she fears that she might give birth to a holoborn child. She doesn't need to dump more information on you because you already know why these holobirths are happening. It's a phenomenon known as Widewind's Legacy, which is the one big problem the Deerwood is facing in the context of the game. And it's bad. Really bad. It also makes you sympathize more with Alfra's situation, and it adds context and gravitas to your mission. Alfra asks you to get a cure from Ranga, an Amawa woman who lives in the ass end of nowhere. So Phase 2, off you go to Ashlock's
It's Anslock's Compass, you idiot, not Ashlock's Compass.
After killing your regular cast of baddies, you meet Ranga. You have a little conversation in which she explains why she's there, where she's from, and she offers a little bit of insight about how people are dealing with Widewind's Legacy. Ranga gives you a potion, but it turns out that it is not a cure for the holoborn disease as Alfra had expected. See, that changes things. Phase 3 is still the same as it is in every other fetch quest. You have to go back to the NPC with the item. But this time it is more important because you also have bad news for Alfra, news that will shatter her hopes to pieces. So as a player, you are probably not going to relish the prospect of having this conversation with Alfra. But you are given options. You can give the potion to Alfra and tell her the truth along with some kind words. You can give her the potion and let her believe the lie that she's told herself, or you can demand that she pays up so that you can get the hell out of there. See, that's how the game gets you invested in the situation and immersed in what's going on in the world. There are big things, important things at stake, and they are deeply rooted in the game's lore. So, is it a fetch quest? Yes. Are there many more quests like this one in Pillars of Eternity? Again, yes. But this is a FedEx simulation quest that effectively masquerades as an adventure because it's deeply embedded in the game's lore and it's strongly related to the curse everyone in the fictitious world of Eora is worried about. There's also a very lengthy and difficult side quest to get rid of a certain noble lord. And this is stuff we have seen plenty of times. Actually, it bears some similarities with Nalia's quest from Baldur's Gate 2. Raedric is the ruling lord of Gilded Vale, a town in which you will be spending some time and doing some quests. And if you pay a little bit of attention, you'll see that everyone in Gilded Vale is on edge because of the Saints' War and Widewind's Legacy. There's an NPC called Kolsk, who's hatching a scheme to oust Raedric, but he doesn't seem to be entirely forthcoming about his agenda. So yes, this is your typical infiltrate fortress and claim it back for someone type of quest. But since the game's lore is woven into the fabric of the quest, the stakes are high and the immersion is off the roof with this one. My favorite quest in Pillars of Eternity is a typical "find this person for me, would you?" Yeah, this one's also been done a million times before, but this one involves half-truths, intrigue, dark religious cults, fantastic locations, moral dilemmas, and of course a lot of relevant lore that is seamlessly revealed to you rather than spoon-fed in a clumsy way. Your main quest is not spectacular though, and we'll talk about that later, but the way in which Pillars of Eternity uses its lore to turn the simplest quests into immersive high-stake adventures presses all the right keys for me in the questing department, and I loved it for it. There's also some exploration to be done in Pillars of Eternity, and it's kinda okay, I guess. They get A for effort, I suppose. Pillars of Eternity has a world map, and you more or less choose the locations you want to go to. Most of the times though, you have to go to X or Y place because this or that quest demands it, and it absolutely has to be the next thing you do. But in most of these locations, aside from a few hidden items that you can find if one of your characters has decent perception, there is nothing to be discovered by means of exploration in Pillars of Eternity. There is a character who asks you to go to a certain place, and that place has hidden items, an NPC with interesting stuff for sale, and a type of enemy that you probably won't have seen by the time you hit the location for the first time. But that's the only location that's off the beaten trail, and it felt like a bit of an exception. There are some secret rooms and corridors to be discovered, and some of them are interconnected in interesting ways, but there are just too many games that have done this before in the past and the present. I really liked scripted events in Pillars of Eternity. I think they were masterfully used to add dramatic tension to the adventure, to emphasize the importance of a certain location, and to give your companions a chance to shine. These little snippets of narration or description, and the decisions that you have to take in them, turn dungeons that would otherwise feel like regular CRPG dungeons into immersive adventures reminiscent of those choose-your-own-adventure books of old, and I loved it. One of these scripted events is even the absolute highlight of the game for me. Pillars of Eternity was one of the first games to champion the return of isometric CRPGs, and while the itemization here is clearly inferior to that of, say, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, it still leaps and bounds better than in those CRPGs of old. There is some pretty neat loot in Pillars of Eternity, and some items can be enhanced by means of enchanting. There are tiers of upgrades that you can go for, and you can even choose from different types of upgrades for your weapons and armor, and that adds tactical value to your gear. And I think that's amazing, because I don't remember that being a thing in games of old. But the best thing about it is that it's super intuitive and easy to do, but we'll talk more about that later. Plus, watching your rogue down an ogre with a couple of strikes with that new weapon you found and enchanted all the way, the satisfaction. There is, however, one thing that didn't work at all for me in Pillars of Eternity. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who felt this way, because it seems like Obsidian took note and greatly improved this aspect of the game in the sequel. And I'm talking about Stronghold management and upkeep. So, after conquering this fortress and turning it into your stronghold, you can purchase upgrades of various types. You can restore some buildings, turn them into shops, and have vendors come to your stronghold to sell their stuff. You can refurbish some areas to add some really powerful resting bonuses to your catalog of services, and there's some sort of bounty master who will have contracts for you to undertake. And these contracts involve tracking and killing some of the most difficult and interesting baddies in the game. There's even an ogre that you can convince to come to live at your place if you have the right skill and choose the right dialogue options. And that's all pretty awesome, sure, but this stronghold management business has several problems. First, none of the vendors in your fortress have anything interesting to sell to you. There is no reason whatsoever to go to these stores after you get them up and running. And this is a wasted opportunity because there is a merchant called Azuro who's regularly selling you stuff through the stronghold management interface. Wouldn't it have been more interesting to have a quest to broker a trading deal with Azuro to have him supply your stores with exceptional items every once in a while? Breath of Fire 2 is a JRPG from the 90s that nailed the stronghold building aspect of the game. In that game, every vendor who sets up shop in your citadel has something unique, or at the very least scarce, to sell you, and there are things like the soul joining that you can only do at your stronghold. And that makes you want to go to your citadel every once in a while. And that's something that doesn't happen in Pillars of Eternity. Second, the game is constantly bothering you with notifications about random shit that's happening at your stronghold, and some of it even requires you to stop doing whatever it is you're doing to go back to Kaed Nua. Yeah, you're given a comfortable number of days to take care of these issues, but it's still a pain in the ass. There are visitors who come to Kaed Nua seeking an audience, and there's absolutely nothing interesting about them. Their petitions are generic, and they add nothing to the action or the plot. And then there are some other petitioners who ask for an escort, and if you don't help them, you get negative rep. But it was never really clear to me why I had to work to prevent my stronghold from getting negative rep, so if the game doesn't seem to give too much of a shit about this, why should I? Also, every once in an unspecified while, your stronghold will be attacked by random groups of enemies. When these attacks occur, you can either choose to resolve them automatically or manually. If you go for the auto-resolve option, get ready to hire an entire cast of new mercenaries, because these guys are made of tissue paper and most of them are going to die. And if you choose to resolve the invasion manually, well, then you have to stop doing what you're doing, go back to your stronghold, and fight the invaders. And many mercenaries are still going to die because they all suck. In Pillars 2, your stronghold is your ship, and that makes everything a lot easier, a lot more enjoyable, and a lot less expensive, not to mention that it is at least believable, to the point that you actually want to engage in this whole stronghold management thing. But we'll talk about that when the time comes. There are also a few puzzles in Pillars of Eternity, and they don't feel like they are there to tick the puzzle box in the gameplay package, as it happens in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and there are no pointless reiterations of the same puzzle. Annoying or poorly placed puzzles can really murder the fun in a CRPG. Thankfully, this doesn't happen in Pillars of Eternity. There is something I think you should know about if you have actually not played Pillars of Eternity and you're thinking about getting it. Pillars handles experience gain in its own special way, so to speak. You get experience every time you visit a new location, be it an area or a dungeon, or sometimes even a building or a floor in a dungeon. You also get experience from questing and disarming traps or lockpicking chests. As for combat, you only get experience the first few times you defeat an enemy type you have not fought before. So every time you fight a certain type of enemy for the first time, an experience gauge of sorts opens, allowing you to gain experience from killing enemies of that type. But once this experience gauge reaches 100%, you'll get no more experience from killing this particular type of baddie. And I get it, but hey, sometimes these baddies come in particularly difficult combinations, and I think you should have gotten experience from killing them regardless of the number of times you have fought them before. But that's okay, I guess. In Pillars you also have reputations. And I think that, as a game mechanic, this works beautifully. Depending on how you conduct yourself throughout your various interactions with the people you meet, you'll develop a reputation as an honest, or benevolent, or cruel, or aggressive individual. And these reputations, because you can have more than one, will open and close doors for you in your journey. Here's an example of how this works. There is this quest in which this NPC asks you to retrieve a tome, known as the Theorems of Pangram. But this tome is stored in a library, which is run by devotees of the god Wal, the god of secrets and mysteries. Now there are several ways to go on about this. If you have a character with really good stealth and lockpicking, you can just sneak into the hall adjacent to the room where the book's being kept, lockpick the door, and steal the tome. But if you're feeling lawful and good, you can talk to the library's headmaster, and of course, she will ask you to do something for her. That something involves finding a scroll and dealing with the bandits who stole it. If you choose to do this, when you finally get the scroll, the god Wal himself tells you that the scroll was meant to be stolen, that this had been his plan all along. He then asks you to bury the scroll at a specific location. You could then choose to do as Wal asked you, or you could go back to the library and return the scroll to the library's headmaster. If you choose to do Wal's bidding, and you return to the library once you are done burying the scroll, when you talk to the headmaster, you'll get the option to tell the truth. And if you have been cultivating a reputation as an honest person, the headmaster will believe you, and she'll give you the key to the room where the Theorems of Pangrams is stored. If you do not have this reputation, you'll have to steal the book or fail the quest. And this is just one of many examples of how reputation works. As a whole, I found gameplay in Pillars of Eternity to be deeply satisfying and thoroughly scratched that 11-year-old itch that I had had since the last great CRPG. Story and lore. I generally talk about this two-termed category as though it were a whole. And yes, for the most part, one can't live without the other. And I think it's very rare for a game to have a great story, but poor lore, or the other way around. I suppose you could say that Citizen Sleeper, the game I just played as a palate cleanser before I took on the task of replaying Pillars of Eternity, tells an extraordinary story, but its lore seems a bit thin to the point of being almost shallow. And games like the original Dark Souls seem to have the, opposite problem. Pillars of Eternity's story has some issues, but its lore is quite simply superb. There are many republics, tribes, fiefdoms, and all of them have consistent idiosyncrasies and predominant ethnicities. All of them have volumes of history, and they are filled with internal and external conflict, rivalries, and stories of failure and success. There have been wars for religious and territorial reasons, there is lingering resentment between some of the people in Eora after the last war, and a lot of other interesting things going on. And every questline and character in the game is deeply imbued in the game's lore. But more importantly, none of it is spoon-fed to you. None of this becomes known to you because the game dumps it on you because the plot needs it. This is all knowledge that you piece together from visiting places, talking to people, and solving problems. In the initial discussion that Aloth has with some townsfolk outside the tavern, when things get heated, the locals start to harass him on account of him being a Dirian, and this is the conversation that follows.
I meant no offense. Let's put this matter to rest over a round, shall we? My treat.
Hoping to soothe our pride with a few Adira coppers, eh? We don't need your coin.
And that's a very smart way to show, rather than tell you, that resentment towards Aedirran people is very much a thing amongst Deerwooden folk. If you have Deerans in your party, who's from the Deerwood, and Aloth is knocked down unconscious during a fight, he says, just like an Aedirran, to go down first. And you can't even really say that hatred towards Aedirran people is the most important thing about Durance' character. Here's another little diamond. People in Deerwood are being born without souls. Hollowborn, they call them. And because of recent historical events, people are calling this phenomenon Widewind's legacy. I could spend this entire video talking about the story of the prophet Widewind and how and why the people of the Deerwood decided to ambush him and blow him up. That's how juicy and well documented this episode in the history of the Deerwood is. Suffice it to say that Widewind was meant to be the reincarnation of the god Eothas, and most people in the Deerwood believe that the curse of the Hollowborn is some sort of divine punishment for killing Widewind. Now there's this scientific bunch known as the Animancers who specialize in the study of souls, and one of them tells you that she doesn't like the term Widewind's legacy because it reeks of superstition, which is absolutely what a science-oriented individual would say. The people of Eora are also unique and fascinating. You have the Valian Republics, for example. This is a secular bunch who have embraced free market as their way of life. And because of this, most Valian people are industrious, goal-oriented, and tend to focus a lot on technological advancement and trade. Their ruling authority isn't a king or a group of nobles, it's an assembly of guilds who look after the Republic's interests. And if the Valian Republics take an interest in other nations' problems, you can bet your bottom dollar that it's because they believe that they can offer a solution. For a price, of course. And I love that this is greatly expanded upon in the sequel. As far as their ethnicity goes, almost all Valians are black, most of them are human, and they all speak with strong Italian accents. And when I complain about the lack of sense of idiosyncrasy and ethnicity in video games, this is what I'm talking about. Pillars of Eternity is the quintessential example of idiosyncrasy done right. Talking about Valians, there are a lot of words and expressions in the Valian tongue that you come to hear during your travels. Some are folkloric pearls of wisdom, some are insults, and some are everyday expressions. You have the word postinago, which is an insult in the Valian language, for example. The literal meaning of this word is carrot, but in Valian culture, it is also used as an insult that means idiot, just like the word capullo in Spanish, which literally means cocoon, but in Spain, it is used to call someone a dimwit, and that's the only Spanish-speaking country that I know of in which the word capullo is used as an insult. Therein lies the sense of idiosyncrasy. That's the key to immersive lore right there, and Pillars of Eternity is probably the best game I've ever played in this respect. As for the story, it's not bad. I think it's a little bit weak beyond the initial stretch, and I'm talking about the main quest, your character's motivation, and the antagonist's plan. I think all of these things become a little bit muddied by the premise that you are a watcher and that your soul awakened when you accidentally witnessed that mysterious event at the beginning of the game. Nothing about the awakening of your soul seems all that urgent or weighty at first. In my opinion, the problem is that they kinda botched the mystery aspect of the story. You learn about the bad guy's motivation, his goddess's motivation, and the truth behind the whole scheme that's been unfolding almost all at once and only very, very, very late in the game. And I admit I was oh boying and oh wowing about every revelation that surfaced near the end of the game, even if some of it was a little bit information dumpy. But for the largest chunk of the game, I wasn't compelled to push forward by the urgency of the situation or by crystal clear goals, like I was in games like Mask of the Betrayer or Planescape Torment. Also, you being a watcher, first, kinda sounds like you're into voyeurism. And second, the game sometimes uses it as a convenient way for you to get important information that would have otherwise required a bit more effort from the writers. It's a clever subterfuge, but a subterfuge nonetheless. But all that's fine, especially because it pays off very nicely in the end. I've seen and played through very, very much worse, I'll tell you. There are, however, a couple of things that I can't forgive Pillars of Eternity for. First, man, they totally mishandled that plot point of the Animancy hearings at the Ducal Palace in Defiance Bay. That assembly, especially because of what transpired and because of how it ended, had lance meat written all over it. It had Omega 4 Relay, Encounter with Bodhi, Meeting with Nasruddin or Kanhua written all over it. What I mean is that right there had to be the plot point before the rising action to the climax. After that event, it should have been a straight shot to the final confrontation with Theos. But nope, past that point, there is still a bunch of unimportant shit to take care of, or more accurately, an entire city filled with relevant side quests, a bunch of characters, more lore, and so on and so forth. And it's not like the quests, characters, and lore in that final location are not good. They are. But by the time I got there, because of how pivotal the hearings at the Ducal Palace were, and especially because of how it all ended, I was already out for Theos' blood, and I didn't give a shit about anything else. Spoiler alert, I suppose, for Baldur's Gate 2, for those who keep complaining about the spoilers. In Baldur's Gate 2, when you leave the underworld and finally meet the elves of Soldanesalar, these guys tell you that you have to seek out Bodhi. It's not easy to get to her, of course, and when you finally do, you collect the last remaining piece of the puzzle. And that's it. There are no more truths to uncover, and no more mysteries to unravel after that. It's time to bring that motherfucker Irenicus down. And when you get to Soldanesalar, you arrive to a place where the shit has already hit the fan. There's chaos and fighting everywhere, but all that shit is 100% relevant to the only mission you care about, and that adds an undeniable feeling of urgency. In Pillars of Eternity, that one event I told you about will no doubt get you hyped up and excited about finally sticking it up to that bastard Theos. True, there are still many questions left unanswered by that point, but maybe you expect to piece everything together during that final run. But nope, the game has other plans. As it happens in Baldur's Gate 2, you arrive to the Elven City, the final destination before your confrontation with the mysterious dude with the great voice acting. But unlike the Elven City of Soldanesalar in Baldur's Gate 2, everyone in the Elven City of Twin Elms seems to be minding their own business. They even seem oblivious to the shitstorm that's going on everywhere else, or at the very least, utterly uninterested. There's a dude worried about his erectile dysfunction, a group of Helia worshippers who are discussing how to get rid of the dragon that has nested in their goddess's temple, and I didn't care about any of it because the game had already exhausted its most impressive plot firework by that moment. The second thing I cannot forgive Pillars for is the decided lack of relevant decision notes. Now don't get me wrong, there's a lot that can go down one way or another in this game depending on your decisions, like that quest about the book and Wild Scroll I told you about. But just not any of the important shit. The important shit depends on two decision notes, both of which take place almost at the end of the game. Thankfully, this is not at all the case with the sequel. For now, it's time to wrap this story and lore bit and give it a score. While I have my problems with the story, Pillars went far beyond to the Call of Duty with its lore, making it one of the most immersive games I've ever played, even considering the fact that there are many things that copycats from Baldur's Gate 2 and other games. And if the lore contained in the game is still not enough for you, there's a 116-page guidebook that I absolutely recommend that you read. Companions lore-wise, I count some of the people you meet along the way in Pillars of Eternity as some of the most fantastic and immersive companions I've ever had in a video game. Some companions in Pillars are top tier stuff, some others are well above average, and there's a couple or three I really don't care about. But as a whole, this is one aspect of the game in which Pillars of Eternity rises head and shoulders above almost everyone else in the business. Adair, Aloth, Sagani, take your pick. All of these guys and gals have a lot to say about the place they call home, their families, the world around them, and the mission at hand. They don't conveniently happen to know stuff that they shouldn't. Their personalities, their attitudes, their behaviors, and their reasoning don't accommodate to what the story needs from them. They are believable, and many of them are endearing. Adair was born in Gilded Vale in a farming family. When it comes to most things, Adair is your average Deerwoodian countryman. He worships the god Eothas, not only because that's the deity his family taught him to worship, but because there's something about Eothas that rings true and right in Adair's heart.
The candles are still burning. Not bad for a dead god. Redemption. And they got this whole right for when you come of age. They take you by the hand and you descend through the temple with your eyes covered, and that's supposed to be like a wicked life. They don't tell you where you're going. I was sweating like crazy when I did mine. They take you to that reflecting pool back there, and you're allowed to look at it so you can face your sins. Then, you come out into this room, and you uncover your eyes again, and everyone's there to greet you, all your friends and family. And it's like you've been redeemed. You light your candle, and it burns with the others. Never had a feeling better than that my whole life.
And although Whitewind was regarded as Eothas' incarnation at first, his actions eventually became violent and cruel, and Adair thought that just couldn't be the work of Eothas. When Whitewind turned his armies against the Deerwood, a war ensued, and Adair's brother Woden enlisted in the army. Woden was the older of the two, and Adair of course admired him and turned to him for advice and inspiration. So, although he was initially against his brother enlisting in the army, not long after Woden had signed up for the war, Adair followed his brother's example and enlisted too. And I won't be spoiling to you where this story goes, but there's a lot of food for thought in the way this companion quest turns out. If you talk to Adair frequently, he will eventually tell you this gut-wrenching story.
The family whose farm I worked on, they had a little Hollowborn girl. When they heard the Animancers had this cure, the Salvation it was called, they went running. This Salvation, they were putting animal souls in children. You might have heard about it, giving them enough personality to care for themselves. You can guess how that turned out. Matter of time, the children broke down, became wild things, monsters. Anyway, these farmers put the family dog's soul in their little girl. For a while, the girl, she's making eye contact, she's feeding herself, albeit in a kinda messy way. And one day she snaps. They found her gnawing on her brother's bones. Had to chain her up, put her in a cow pen. Well, the mother, she wouldn't have anything to do with the girl after that. But the father, he'd visit every day, feed her chickens, toss water on her once in a while to get the dirt off. Most of the village, they'd whisper about him. Poor man, they'd say, sick with grief. He was just waiting for his daughter to look up one day and recognize her papa. He was waiting for her to get better. Didn't understand that at the time, of course, but these days I think about him a lot.
And I totally believe that a countryman like Adair would have a story such as this to tell people. He is also a light-hearted man who likes simple humor and animals, and he has absolutely phenomenal voice acting. Companions like Adair aren't an exception in Pillars of Eternity, they are the rule. I could have chosen anyone as an example. Sagani has a fascinating companion quest, and she's a window into the culture and way of life of Nasitak and her village of Masuk. She's got a fox companion called Itumak, but her whole existence does not revolve around him. She's naive, and because of that she's easy prey to city charlatans, because she's from a fishing village, but she's also resourceful and resolute. And she would have been an awesome romantic interest for my dwarf PC if romance had been a thing in this game, and if she weren't married, and the mother of 5. Okay, so maybe not. And then there is Aloth, who is probably my favorite of the bunch. He is an Aediran elven mage who's had access to top-grade education, and he has the knowledge and the vocabulary to match. His personal story is a tragic one, but also very relatable. It's also the key to an alternative explanation to his, condition. A fourth wall-breaking explanation even. And the list doesn't even stop there. You have Durance, the Magramite priest who was one of the 12 priests who created the Godhammer. Durance turns out to be far more complex than he originally seems, and unexpectedly funny in his own way, a way that I am sure was very much intended. There is also the Grieving Mother. This is one of my favorite companions in the game. It had me pondering about the moral dilemmas that come with power, and the metaphor that she weaves around the concept of the call made my skin crawl and it left me breathless. Truly magnificent writing that. One thing I hated about her though, is that she is probably the character that has the most lines, but almost none of them are voiced. I didn't care too much about Pajagina or Kana, and despite the fact that he has an interesting backstory and a decent companion quest, I found Hiravius to be a little bit immersion-breaking and irritating. The expressions that he used and the way in which he talked didn't seem like they belonged in this fantasy world.
Are you fucking kidding me?
As for those companions you meet during the White March Part 1 and 2 expansion packs, well, we'll be talking about those when we talk about the White March Part 1 and 2 expansion packs. I'd also like to mention that your companions intervene quite a lot in story-related situations, and they can even do useful stuff that alters the outcome of a quest. My favorite thing about this is that they can even offer their help during other companions' missions. This is not something that you see often, and I love it when it happens. This is definitely one of the many aspects of the game in which Pillars pressed all the right keys for me. Companions gameplay-wise. You can build a solid party with your scripted companions in Pillars of Eternity early on in the game. You get a decent tank, a magic DPS specialist, and a healer during your first couple of hours. And not long after that, you get a chanter to round things up. And if you haven't hired an adventurer by this point, you'll still have an available spot for quite a while after you meet this guy. And I think this is by design. Early on in the game, when you're done talking to people and collecting quests in Gilded Vale, you'll get the feeling that the time for adventuring out in the open has come. and you'll also probably get the feeling that 3 people are just not going to cut it. You're going to need someone else, and chances are that you'll already know by then that you can hire adventurers at the local tavern, and this is probably the best decision you can make. I don't think it takes a genius to detect what's missing in the initial party, and making the right decision at that time goes a long way. And I think this is awesome because, as I said, you'll have to adventure for a long time before you have a full party of adventurers. And this almost forces you to hire another person. And yeah, I know there are some advantages of having a smaller party. But the adventurer hiring mechanic at the tavern basically allows you to create whichever companion you want on the fly. I love how this was done, I love how it played out in the game, and it made me feel like I was in control of my party's build as much as I wanted to. And by the way, those companions you do not take with you on an adventure will still level while they are not in your party. And that means that they'll always remain a viable option to take with you in future adventures. It's also noteworthy that your companion's talents will come in useful for non-combat situations, and that's always a plus. Secondary mechanics and user experience. Pillars of Eternity has item management, trading, and crafting in addition to its main game mechanics, and I have been waiting a year and a half to say this about this game, so here it goes. This is how it's done, guys. Or at the very least, Pillars presses all the right keys for me when it comes to its secondary mechanics and user experience. Let's start with inventory management. Each companion in your party has a number of slots to store his or her loot, but you also have a stash. A limitless stash. And I, for one, am very pleasantly surprised and relieved with the fact that you'll never hear, "I am overburdened" in Pillars of Eternity. Come to think of it, this is probably my most hated phrase ever in a video game. And in games in which you can loot everything that's not nailed down, a limited inventory capacity becomes a problem almost immediately if you're a hoarder like me. In Morrowind, for example, you won't even be able to step out of the first building if you loot everything that stands in your way. What I tend to do in these games with limited inventory capacity is submit myself to tedium by going back and forth between locations just to hoard all the loot, including forks, spoons, and dishes. Hey, I worked hard to get to that location. I worked hard to clear it of baddies. I should be able to pick it clean and make a coin or two, right? Now, I don't know if you find this limitless stash feature in Pillars of Eternity immersion breaking. I can see why someone would, but to me, this is a blessing. Also, when you loot anything, be it a corpse or a chest, you get this delicious interface that allows you to decide whether you want to store the loot in the stash or assign it to a character. Yes, you can assign the loot to your companion of choice there and then. And because you have a view of every companion and their loot, and because you can pull up the stash window and just move it around at your leisure, you can always compare every item everywhere to anything anyone's got equipped, and all this without switching screens. And I fucking love it. You also get tabs, filters, and lots of other goody features to aid your inventory management. I do have a teeny tiny complaint about inventory management that only applies while you're on the trading interface. My complaint is that you can't compare the items that you're currently trading with any of the secondary weapons equipped by your characters. Also, the most important information about potions, food, and scrolls is not readily available in the description, so you have to do some extra clicking, but again, no biggie. Trading is equally intuitive and powerful. You have these rows at the bottom of the trading screen to which you add the items you wish to trade, and it is as simple as clicking on your item of choice or opening up the stash and clicking on the item. And of course, the trading interface does not reset if you switch characters. Was this so hard to get right, Divinity Original Sin II? And you can always make a last-minute comparison by simply clicking on your companion of choice and hovering over the item that interests you. Developers everywhere, this is how it's fucking done. Please take note. There's also crafting and weapon enhancement. This is beautiful. It's intuitive, simple, powerful, and because of that, you end up doing it frequently, and as a result, you end up having the best gear and the best potions at all times. This is how it works. You click on crafting. You choose your preferred category. Notice that these aren't exclusive. You can open and browse every fucking item in every fucking category at once if you so wish to. And when you click on the item, oh wow, you get a complete description of what the item does and the ingredients that are needed for its preparation. And of course, those for which you have the ingredients appear in bright white, and those you can't are grayed out, but they are still clickable nonetheless. So you choose the item you want to craft and the quantity, and boom, done. So beautiful. And item enhancement works in the exact same way. Weapons and armor can be enchanted in Pillars of Eternity, and it is as simple as clicking on the enchant button, browsing the available enchantments, and enchanting. If you are doubtful about which item you want to enhance, you can always click on the compare button to display a deep comparison between the item you are currently using and the other item. But all of this wouldn't mean shit if the game's challenge did not require you to keep your gear optimized to the fullest and pay attention to your stock of consumables. But if you play the game the Path of the Damned difficulty level, your gear and your consumables will be a big part of your game. Secondary mechanics are almost perfect in Pillars of Eternity, and I am a bit surprised at the number of games, very good games even, that fuck this up so very badly. Their developers could have taken more than a pointer or two from Pillars. User experience is also great beyond the way in which you interface with trading or item management. Lockpicking, disarming traps, interfacing with items, combat, it all works pretty seamlessly, except for your friendly AI, which is pretty crappy when it comes to movement. Companions are always on each other's ways, and sometimes when they have to choose between two available paths to get to where you clicked, they choose the one that's most likely to generate a disengagement attack, which is the equivalent of an attack of opportunity. It does get annoying from time to time, but it is nothing too serious. Some people complain that there are too many loading screens, but I didn't feel like they were that many, and it also didn't feel like they took that long. They are ugly as fuck though. Why that wall? To wrap things up, I'll say that secondary mechanics in Pillars of Eternity are amongst the best I've ever had, and user experience is way above average in the genre. Sound effects and mix. Holy shit, this is bad. Really bad. Like 2000s bad. That's how bad it is. Many melee attacks don't make a sound when they land, and this even applies to critical hits and killing blows. I often had to pay special attention to what was going on to make sure I had killed a mob, and this is how Grace's sound.
Understood.
Ugh. It's so wimpy. If this sound had a face, it would be this. And spells aren't much better either. This is how the AoE lightning spell sounds. It sounds like someone is banging on an aluminium sheet, and it is so poorly mixed that it completely buries every other sound. And this is how a magic bolt sounds in Pillars of Eternity. Released in the year 2015. And this is how it sounds in Neverwinter Nights 2, released in the year 2006. And it's not just combat sounds that are bad. Sometimes when NPCs talk, they sound like they are a mile away. The sonic landscape in locations like taverns, squares, or halls is thin, and the few sounds that you do get are muddy. And there are also volume issues. There are year 2000 sound issues going on, and this is just not acceptable in a game that came out in the year 2015. Music.
A dim lantern is only protection against the encroaching darkness. But the skies bring no comfort, shining no light, betraying no hint of what they know.
While production values aren't great in Pillar's score, the composition is spot on. It does sound a little bit too synthy, and therefore a little bit too low budgety, but it's adventure-y and mysterious when it needs to be, thrilling and grandiose in combat, and very tavern-y if a little bit overdone in taverns, brothels, and inns. I felt it was adequately immersive and not without its highlights here and there. I especially appreciate that it's always in tune with the dramatic intention of the passage. But there are many games that did this before back in the day, and many more that have done it way better in recent memory too. So compared to those other titles, I would say it's just a little bit above average. Voice acting.
You have stayed true to our cause, Inquisitor, when so many others have not. For every heretic we confess, for every betrayer that burns on our pyres, new sheep continue to flock to Iavara Extensios. But not you. I underestimated you in the beginning, but no longer. It is not for honor that I summoned you today, but for duty. Too many of our own have confessed upon the wheel and the rack and the flame. Too many of our faithful have had their minds poisoned by the Kratom witch.
The others are welcome, but it's best if just you and I trade words, and your shadows stay quiet. Hands off their weapons, both arcane and steel. It's only you I want to trade words with anyway. I swear before the whore that is Margaret, no harm will come to you in her shadow, if that's enough of a promise for you. If not...
Pillars is not entirely voiced, and I can think of few games that have pissed me off worse than this one because of that. Why? In part because it has some of the best voice acting out there. Durin's, Eder, Theos, and many others are phenomenal. These voices fit their respective characters like a glove, and they infuse them with fascinating personalities that make each of them feel real. And it's not just the voices per se that are great. You can tell that there was some pretty on-point voice direction here. Every voice actor here seems aware of the dramatic intention of every passage and his or her character's insights at all times. It's not impeccable though, far from it in fact. For example, there's this character that is pivotal, crucial to get you invested in the game's whole premise. And the voice acting is terrible in this one. And then there is this badass dragon that's trying too hard. And of course the fact that the game is not entirely voiced. And I was definitely not a fan of that. Thankfully, none of this is a problem in the sequel. Overall, I think the quality of the voice acting outweighs by far the game's shortcomings in this department. Graphics. I get it. Pillars of Eternity was meant to be a tribute, a shout-out, a throwback to our beloved Infinity Engine games of old. The core game borrows liberally from Baldur's Gate 2, and its expansions look and feel a lot like Icewind Dale. But I think this works against the game almost as much as it favors it. As far as locations go, I think Andra's Gift is the perfect example of this. It is a shameless copycat of the Athkatla docks in the city of Amn in Baldur's Gate 2, and yes, the nostalgia is strong in this one, but it also looks too derivative of something we have already seen, and as a result, it fails to impress by its own merits. This is also true of Raedric's Hold, for example. It looks and feels a lot like the Arnis estate, only bigger and more detailed. Which is expected, I suppose, since it was created 15 years later than its source of inspiration. But because we have seen this before, it feels a little bit lacking on the artistic side of things. As I've said before, I think the Endless Paths are meant to be a bit of a tribute to the Temple of Elemental Evil, and more importantly, the Watcher's Keep in Baldur's Gate 2. But it feels like something that has been done before, and this also applies to the art. There are also a lot of forests in Pillars of Eternity, and they all look the same. And that is, well, boring and generic, with points of interest being too few and too far in between. Not all locations are terrible though. Defiance Bay is a believable enough city, it looks consistent with the game's lore, and it feels lived in. To some extent I guess, and fairly busy. Taverns and brothels are alive, and they do feel taverny enough, but compared to the locations in some of the best CRPGs that came out more or less around its time, the original Pillars does not look great. In Gwithin Ruins, the District of Old Song in Twin Elms, and the final location are standout locations, and those look pretty unique and interesting. Character models aren't great. Even when your companions are wearing the best gear in the game, they look unremarkable, like regular NPCs. And this also applies to enemies. Of course, trolls and ogres are going to look better on a vis-a-vis comparison to games that came out 20 years ago, but they look derivative, and some of them artistically uninspired. There are a few exceptions of course, but that's all they are, exceptions. Item thumbnails are nothing to write home about, but some have cool little artwork when you inspect them. Speaking of artwork, I actually think those stills you get at the end of every act while you're listening to the narration, and the art in the scripted events are the highlights in the graphic department. The game's hub is okay. It feels consistent with the game's theme, and user experience-wise it works the way we expect it. Overall, I think production values aren't Pillars of Eternity's forte, and graphics unfortunately are not an exception to this. Performance and stability. I experienced no crashes at all, and I don't remember having any FPS drop issues, and I paid close attention to that because the game can get very busy from time to time. Also, I don't know if this is because my computer far exceeds the recommended build or what, but I don't feel like there were too many loading screens, and I don't feel like they were too long either. In the game you get some announcements in the form of a scroll in the top left corner of your screen, and some of those didn't go away until I switched locations, but that of course is an insignificant issue. Other considerations and final thoughts. A poor man's Baldur's Gate 2. I think this is a little bit harsh. Not entirely inaccurate, but harsh. Listen, I think Greedfall is 90% a poor man's Witcher 3, and Torchlight is a poor man's Diablo 2, and I still liked these games very much. And I like Pillars of Eternity very much for the same reasons. It does not live up to Baldur's Gate 2 in every respect. Hell, it may not even live up to Baldur's Gate 2 when it comes to stuff that is really important to me, like impactful decision nodes. But by the time it came out in the year 2015, 11 years had passed since the release of the last relevant isometric medieval fantasy RPG, and Pillars of Eternity did more than enough to bring back my favorite genre in my favorite presentation. A presentation I thought was dead for good. And it just pressed all the right keys for me. It featured interesting tactical combat, it weaved an immersive narrative around a robust and thought-provoking lore, it gave me fascinating companions, it provided a balanced combination of combat and questing, and brought back a bit of the feeling I used to get from those choose-your-own-adventure books of old. And therein lies the magic of this game for me. And while many of you don't seem to like Pillars, I can only speak from my perspective. And that being the case, I just can't recommend it enough if you are a medieval fantasy guy or gal. If you don't already have it, go get it. And happy adventuring. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you're seeing in this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Share the video, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.